Chapter 17. Picnic. "Kelly, Miguel, Doug!" It was Tina yelling at the top of her lungs. Miguel and Kelly stared at each other for a moment, then they started to run. When they came through the trees into the clearing, they saw her. Tina was carefully spreading a white sheet out on the ground. She stood up when she saw them coming. She put a fist against her hip. "There you are," she said. "I've been looking all over for you. Where did everybody go, and where's Doug?" Kelly stopped running. She stood, one hand across her chest, trying to catch her breath. "He's not—" She pointed at her cabin. Tina looked surprised. "Oh, you guys stayed in that cabin? I was looking in cabin 7. Miguel strode forward. "Listen, what's the idea of shouting like that? You really scared the—" He stopped himself too late. The word was out. "I scared you?" Tina asked, laughing delightfully. "Kelly, did you hear what I heard? I scared Macho Man." "Oh, cut the crap," Miguel said sourly. "What did you want us for anyway?" "Breakfast," Tina said. She gestured at the bags of potato chips, boxes of cereal, and other food she had bought at the supermarket on the trip up. "I've decided to share," she said proudly. "But if you keep acting so huffy, I'll change my mind." Miguel plopped down on the corner of the sheet. "Great," he said. "Feed me, woman." "Miguel," Tina said, "I told you I don't like that joke." "Doug?" Kelly called as she headed for their cabin. She found him face down on his sleeping bag, legs splayed. "Doug!" "Please don't wake me up," he said into his pillow of a shirt. "We're having breakfast." "I'll pass." "I need to talk to everyone," Kelly insisted. Doug grunted. "I'll be there in a few hours, okay?" She laughed, but said, "Now!" And she said it firmly enough that she was sure she had gotten her point across. Sure enough, Doug showed up a few minutes later. Big Red showed up 2 minutes after that. Not that anyone saw him. He stood in the dark shade of the woods, watching the group's little picnic. His large head was throbbing. He felt like his brain was glued to the roof of his skull. He was also hungry, and the kids looked like such nice boys and girls. Maybe they would share. Out in the clearing, everyone was sitting on the sheet, passing around the box of fat-free granola, scooping out handfuls with their bare hands. Kelly said, "Okay, here's what we've got to do today. We've got to spread more bait." They all stared at her blankly. "I brought 2 tape recorders," Kelly went on. I figure I'll take one and work around the east side of the lake." She pulled her map of Crystal Lake out of her jacket pocket and smoothed it out against her thigh. She pointed. "I'll try to cover this area here. Miguel, you and Tina take the other tape recorder and go west. There are still some vacation houses and other people living down there." "What's all this about?" Tina asked morosely. "We're going to knock on doors," Kelly explained. "Pretend we're reporters or something, you know? Like, we're collecting information on Jason and the whole legend thing. But everyone we talk to, we make sure we drop the news that we're staying here." "What about me?" Doug asked sleepily. "You stay here." "I love this plan," Doug said. "Yeah, but no sleeping. You guys really let me down last night. We need someone watching the trap at all times." They all stared at her blankly again. No one looked too excited about her plan, that was for sure. Big Red was excited. He could hear what the boys and girls were saying, but he wanted to join them, play with them, eat with them. Kelly," Tina began, "I really think I ought to be getting back home." "Why?" Miguel demanded. "You don't have anything to do back there." "So? I don't have anything to do here either." Miguel and Tina were staring at each other so crossly that Kelly felt like at any moment they might come to blows. "Hold it," she said. "Tina, if you want to go, that's fine with me. Same goes for you, Miguel, and you, Dougie. I mean it." "Thanks a lot," Doug said. His eyes were closed. He was sitting cross-legged, leaning back on his hands, his handsome face tilted up to catch the rays. "If you go," Miguel said to Tina, "how are we going to get home?" I don't know, Tina said with a shrug. A bus? I'm sorry, guys. I don't want to be a party pooper, but let's face it. This is so boring. As Tina went on complaining, Kelly studied her face. She was surprised by what she was thinking. She was thinking that Tina was lying. Big Red was also staring hard at Tina. She was a pretty girl with black hair that went all the way down her back. But she was making these faces. Nasty faces. It reminded Big Red of something. At first he couldn't think what. Then he had it. He saw himself walking past a group of teenagers hanging out in front of Denny's Diner. He hadn't been able to hear what they were saying that time either. But he saw one girl making those same nasty faces and pointing at him. Then all the teenagers laughed. They laughed right at Big Red. Doug burst out laughing. Sorry, he said, but you know what you sound like, Tina? You sound like you're blaming Kelly, 'cause we didn't get any monster action last night. That's ridiculous, Tina said, but Doug kept chuckling. He's laughing at me, thought Big Red. Suddenly Tina gasped and dropped the cereal box. A green grasshopper had hopped right onto her hand. Now it was Kelly who laughed. She flicked her hand out as expertly as a frog whipping out its tongue. She caught the grasshopper in her fist. She raised the fist to her mouth and bit off the grasshopper's head. There were loud, horrified groans from the rest of the group. Yummy, Kelly said, chewing. You really are insane, Tina said, her eyes wide. Kelly laughed again as she finished the rest of the insect. These guys were so easy to gross out. All bugs are good food, pretty much, she said, chewing. She licked her lips. Tina stood up quickly. I think I'm going to throw up. Kelly laughed harder. Seriously, you guys should check it out. Ants are the only bugs that taste bitter because they've got a lot of formic acid in them. And all bugs are very nutritious. Probably better for you than granola crap. Boone and I once spent a week eating nothing but grubworms. Everyone was making puking sounds now. Kelly laughed harder. In the woods, Big Red began to tremble. Now the blonde girl was laughing at him too. So many times he had been made fun of by teenagers. Teenagers just like these. The bad memories were washing over him. The time those teenagers had pelted him with rocks. The time they had pushed him into the lake. The time. Big Red couldn't help it. He was getting angry again. These kids, these lousy brats, they would have to pay. In the end, Tina agreed to spend just one more day at Crystal Lake and to follow Kelly's instructions no matter how stupid she thought they were. After breakfast, Tina and Miguel went off one way, Kelly went off the other. Kelly tried to give Miguel the knife, but he insisted he didn't need any weapons, that his hands were registered as deadly force. So Kelly took the knife. She left Doug with the gun. As soon as they left, Doug stretched out and went to sleep. He didn't wake up for 3 hours. He didn't wake up until the large dark shadow fell across his face. He opened his eyes, squinting upward. Then he sat up very, very quickly. Chapter 18. Darlene falls for Doug. Darlene, Doug said, with a happy grin. By way of a hello, the waitress cracked a wad of gum. She wasn't wearing her waitress uniform. She was wearing jeans and a red sweater, both very tight and looking even sexier than she had the evening before. Taking it easy, hon? She asked him. That's right, he grinned toothily. What brings you out here? She glanced off into the woods, as if she weren't really interested in their conversation at all, as if she had driven all the way out here into the woods for no particular reason. She didn't succeed in looking casual, though. Actually, she looked a little nervous. Well, I've got the afternoon off, she said. Thought I'd come see how y'all all were doing. They left me, Darlene, Doug said, still lying down, still grinning wildly. My friends left me here, all alone. I'm sorry to hear that. But she flashed him a brief and radiant smile. Oh, me too, Doug agreed. It was still a magical thing to him, even after so many successful encounters with women, the ease with which he could bring off these little transactions. There was always a point, early on, when he realized it was all going to go his way, when he realized that the woman wanted him, Doug Sanderson. This realization had never lost its thrill, and he was feeling that thrill right now. Except it wasn't a pure thrill, because there was also Kelly to think about, and Tina. Now he'd be sort of cheating on them both, he thought. He sat up and rocked back and forth, then jumped to his feet athletically. Standing, he was taller than Darlene. He gazed down at her. "Hi," she said, lowering her eyes. "Hi," he said, eyes steady, boring into hers. "So, what are you doing right now?" Darlene asked. "Right now?" Doug scratched his sleek and handsome head in an imitation of thought. "Well, the thing is, I'm still awful tired." She eyed him thoughtfully. "Is that right?" "It is, Darlene. I don't know what it is, but I'm just exhausted." "Don't do this," he ordered himself, but it was such an old habit with him, like falling off a log. You know what I was thinking of doing, Darlene? I was thinking maybe I'd go in that cabin there and finish off my nap." Darlene smiled mischievously. "Uh-huh. And what am I supposed to do while you're sleeping?" "Well, that's just the thing. See, I can't fall asleep unless someone sings me a lullaby." It was a bold move, and for one dizzying moment Doug thought maybe this time he had gone too far. But then Darlene laughed so loudly she had to cover her mouth. "You crack me up," she said. "I'm glad to hear it, Darlene. I really am. So, will you do that for me? Will you sing me a lullaby?" "I can't sing." "Oh, I bet you can. Now, I'm just going to walk around a second. Make sure the coast is clear, as it were. You can go make yourself at home in that cabin there. I won't be a minute." "That one right there in the middle?" "Yup. The one with the clothes hanging off the porch and the burnt-out candles in the windows." Darlene started walking forward. She was halfway to the cabin when she turned to look back at him. "Don't be long," she told him. "Oh, I won't." Then she turned back, heading straight for the cabin's front door. Doug started off down the trail, leaving Darlene to fall to her death in Chapter 19, Trapped. "The trap!" Doug froze. He whirled around. "Darlene!" he shouted. The waitress stopped as if paralyzed. He raced toward her. "Don't move!" he yelled. She didn't move. He grabbed her shoulders, pulling her back toward him. "What?" she asked, terrified. "What is it?" Doug was laughing. "Oh, man, that was close. You see, there's a trap there. See it? No, you can't see it. That's the amazing thing. But, Darlene, you almost bought the farm. Here, you've got to go all the way around like this." "That's right. Sorry about that. Didn't mean to scare you. Now don't go away. I'll be right back." He jumped off the porch, made a wide circle around the trap, and started off down toward the lake. Wow, that was close. Doug hurried down the trail to the lake. He felt so excited he thought he was going to faint. And at that same time he felt awful about what he was doing. But he couldn't help himself. He was so horny. It was as if he had fallen into a trap of his own. There was no going back. Doug went all the way down to the lake. He wanted to make extra sure he and Darlene were alone. He called out to Kelly, then Miguel, then Tina. He was satisfied with the silence he heard in response. They were probably miles away. Doug kept grinning all the way back to the cabin. He had his hands in the pockets of his khaki shorts. For no reason he could think of, he started singing. Someone's in the kitchen with Dinah. Someone's in the kitchen, I know. Oh, oh, oh. Someone's in the kitchen with Dinah. Darlene was waiting for him, a bare leg dangling from the upper bunk. Doug felt a surge of excitement, until he noticed the waitress's other bare leg. The other leg was sticking out of the lower bunk. For a split second, Doug was too stunned to move. He slowly turned his head from left to right, panning the cabin, which meant he saw the rest of Darlene. The pieces were spread out over the metal bunk beds, an arm here, a head there. But it wasn't until Doug turned his head all the way to the right that he saw the huge man in the blue overalls and the hockey mask. Big Red was holding a bloody axe high over his masked head. He charged. Doug stepped back through the open doorway and fell hard onto his rump on the porch. Big Red was on him in a flash, swinging the axe down. Doug scuttled backward, doing a crab walk across the porch, keeping his toes just inches beyond the heavy blows of the axe. Suddenly, Big Red's artificial leg snapped up into the air. The blue lucite foot was right over Doug's head. It was about to crush him. And Doug had reached the edge of the porch. No place left to go except... Doug did a sort of a backflip, flinging himself off the porch as hard as he could. He was planning, to the extent that he could think at all, to hit the ground, scramble up, and start running. But he had forgotten about the trap. Screaming, he crashed right through the flimsy cover of thin branches and leaves. Big Red stared down in surprise as Doug dropped down onto the sharp stakes below. Chapter 20. Breaking Up. Big Red stood at the edge of the trap trying to decide whether or not he could chop up Doug's dead body. The voice in his head told him the answer, just as it had told him to go back to Ma and Pa's shack this morning and get Pa's axe. There were still 3 others for Big Red to deal with. When he had finished all his homework, then he could play. Gotcha! Miguel cried. He stabbed the water with his stick, then pulled the stick back out. He had caught nothing, as usual. Brilliant, Tina said. Like Kelly, Tina and Miguel had spent their Friday wandering through the woods, knocking on doors. Few people answered, and several of those who did answered the door with shotguns in their hands. By sundown, Tina was tired and starving and mad at herself for going along with Kelly's crazy plan once more. And when they had finally made it back to camp, there was no one there. So for the last hour, Tina and Miguel had been sitting at the edge of the lake. Miguel was trying to spear frogs with a stick so they could grill them over a campfire tonight. He had boasted that he could catch every frog in the lake in about 10 minutes. So far, he had only succeeded in falling in the water twice. Tina was hunkered down beside her boyfriend, sitting on her heels. There was a tension inside her, a tension that had been building up all day. She knew what it was she had to say, but she was trying desperately to hold it in. This wasn't going to be pretty, she knew. This was going to be bloody awful. "Miguel," she began. "What?" he asked without turning around. But she had run out of courage again. "I don't know," she said finally. As she watched the surface of the lake, a mosquito buzzed too close to the water and got gobbled up by a little fish. It gave her courage, in a way. What she was going to do to Miguel was all part of the natural order of things. All around them, creatures were struggling for survival, feeding on each other, looking for prey. "Come on now," Tina told herself. "Tell him." Instead, she said, "A lot of good this tape recorder turned out to be." She idly pressed record, stop, and record. What did we tape? A lot of people telling us to get lost? Now, you gotta think about it. Now they know we're here. That's all that matters, Miguel said. You heard what Kelly said. Yeah, I heard her. She also heard a strange sound behind her in the thick, dark woods, like a large animal crunching through the underbrush. She turned and stared behind them for several seconds. She thought she caught a glimpse of something moving around back there. Something about the size of a moose. She wasn't going to tell Miguel, though. He'd chase the thing with his little spear and probably get them both killed. She watched the woods for a minute more, but there were no more sounds. No more movements. "I hate the woods," she said. "Why?" She didn't answer. Instead, she dropped a pebble into the water, watched the spreading circles. The water was deep here and muddy. "Miguel," she said after a long silence, "when we get back to Newkirk, I'm breaking up with you." Miguel's head jerked toward her, a shocked look on his face. He laughed nervously. "Cool. Yeah, cool." Breaking up was like diving off a high board. At a certain point, you just had to close your eyes and leap. Now she was falling, and there was no way to avoid the big splash. "I'm serious," Tina said. "Yeah, tell me another." "Fine, don't believe me." She waited for Miguel to say something more. She couldn't believe he was just ignoring her. It made her so mad she blurted out, "Listen, there's something I've got to tell you, okay? Last night, Doug and I did more than watch that stupid trap, okay? I mean, are you satisfied now?" Miguel turned his head slowly toward her, his eyes dark, ferocious. "What are you saying?" "You figure it out. Doug and I are going out now. Get it? We're an item. You want me to draw you a picture?" Miguel's face flushed dark and red, as if it had been splashed with blood. I don't believe you, Tina," he stammered. "Believe me." Doug goes out with Kelly." "Duh! He's dumping that girl as soon as we get home." Miguel looked away from her. Then he doubled over as if he'd been punched in the stomach. He started stabbing the water furiously with his stick. He gave several short animal screams of pain. "Listen," Tina said. She went over and put her hand on his big biceps, but he jerked his arm away. His shoulders shook. He was crying. "Hey," Tina said, feeling awful. I'm sorry it happened this way, but..." She didn't finish the sentence, because right then she saw Big Red's reflection in the water. He was raising his bloody axe right over her head. Chapter 21. Hide and Go Seek. Big Red swung, aiming for the girl's head. He missed, because just before he swung, the girl leaped forward into the water. She started swimming frantically. That left the boy. Big Red raised his axe again. The boy turned to face him. His cheeks were stained with tears. He was shaking all over. His mouth was open. Good. Good to see these lousy brats scared for once, thought Big Red, just the way they had scared him. "Miguel, do your judo!" It was the girl in the water screaming to the boy. "Do your judo!" Miguel was barely aware of her shouts, and it was only in the furthest recess of his terrified brain that he knew what she was talking about. In class, Miguel had each of his students charge at him with a club raised over their heads. One after another, Miguel flipped his assailants down onto the wrestling mat, then took away the club and held it to the student's throat. Only this wasn't class, and Miguel was shaking so hard he could barely hear what Tina was saying. There was a warm trickle running down his pant legs, which he was only vaguely aware was his own urine. And Big Red had the axe raised high in the air. Miguel turned and ran. Tina swam hard all the way around the bend. When she turned the corner out into the wide waters of the lake, she saw a gray raft floating in the distance like a mirage. She swam out to it, grabbed hold of the rusty metal ladder on the raft's side. Then she started screaming for help. When she stopped screaming, the silence that confronted her was total, vast. All around her stretched gray, unruffled water. The lake was edged by thick woods. She couldn't see any houses. Who could hear her scream? Only that maniac with the axe. She became very quiet. She would just stay here, she decided, hanging on to the raft. She would stay in the water, stay very still. If she saw that crazy man along the shore, she could just duck down under the water. He'd never see her. The vast water was cool and gentle. It felt like it was tickling her, taking tiny nips from her skin. But her waterlogged clothes and sneakers were weighing her down, pulling her farther out of the water with one hand. She reached down with her free hand and started to untie her shoelaces. Running, falling, back on his feet, branches smacking his chest and arms, vines cutting his face. It was as if someone had attached a huge power cable to Miguel's body. The electricity of fear was flowing through him. So much fear that it was almost impossible for him to process what was happening to him. The big man was after him. The man with the mask. The man with the axe. The big man was running, thundering through the woods right behind him. And sometimes the big man's footsteps sounded like metal the way they banged down on the rocks. Miguel ran screaming into the clearing, ringed with cabins, screaming, "Dog!" screaming, "Help!" And then the big man came racing into the clearing as well, and Miguel raced out of the clearing, taking the first trail he saw. It was pure luck that led him down the trail that led to the Apache scout nest. Miguel forced himself to run faster. He needed a lead. Then came the clearing, the hideout. He hit the ground, pulling the leafy hatch down over him. And then he lay as still as he could, which wasn't very still because his heart was banging against his chest like a hammer. It was banging so hard he could see in his mind's eye the little red organ wildly expanding and contracting inside of him. An instant later he heard, and felt with his body, the big man's footsteps as he pounded through the woods. The footsteps crunched right over the hatch door. Kelly's cover of branches bent down so far that Miguel took most of the man's weight with his body. One foot, a foot that was hard as steel, caught the edge of Miguel's nose and cheek. But still Miguel didn't cry out or make a sound. He lay still. He could feel the blood leaking freely out of his nose. Tears were running straight down the sides of his face and collecting in his ears. He was so terrified, and that wasn't all. He was finally able to think again, and that meant he was able to think about how he was reacting. His father always said you could never predict how you'd do in a battle. Well, now Miguel didn't have to predict. He knew. He had turned and run. Not just run, pissed in his pants. The big war hero. Miguel froze, suddenly reaching a new level of terror. The big man's footsteps were coming back toward the scout nest. He could hear the big man's heavy breathing. The man came closer. Through cracks in the leaves and branches, Miguel could see the big man standing, only yards away, turning his big masked face slowly back and forth. Miguel could not breathe. Finally, the big man turned and continued on his way. Miguel was about to leap up out of the trap when he heard more footsteps. These were softer steps, nowhere near as big a man this time. "Big Red!" called a voice. It was a familiar voice, but Miguel couldn't place it. He didn't have time to think about it, because now the big man was coming back toward his hideout. Again, the familiar voice. "He's right here, Big Red! No! Here! Look down!" The huge man looked down. Miguel was too scared to move. Chapter 22. Dumb Kids. Officer Donner hurried out of Denny's diner, heading for his cruiser. He was a large man with a bristly mustache. He was moving so fast that some of the coffee he was carrying sloshed and burned his wrist. He cursed, and not because of the coffee. It had been a horrible, horrible day. 3 young kids had seen their grandfather murdered in Holloway. Reports of Tuck missing, along with Gabe and Ruth Gleason, and their retarded son, Big Red. It was beginning to look like someone had gone on a rampage. Exhausted and hoping for a moment's peace, Donner had stopped by the diner for his evening cup of coffee. So, what does the cook tell him? The waitress, Darlene Skinner, didn't show up for work this afternoon. Not only that, two of the customers told Donner that some teenagers had come knocking on their doors this very afternoon, saying they wanted info on the Jason legend of all things, saying they were staying out at the old camp. Donner jumped into the car. He set the coffee on the seat beside him, twisted the ignition key hard, revving the motor. "Kids," he muttered as he sped toward the lake. "Dumb kids." Tina stayed in the water, clinging to the edge of the raft for a long, long time. She didn't know how much longer she could hold out. She was starting to get this very weak and sleepy feeling. She felt so drained. It was an hour before she spotted movement in the woods. She let go of the raft and let herself drop down into the water, trying not to make a splash. She had planned for this situation. She would put the raft in between her and the crazy man. Taking a huge gulp of breath, she started swimming gently. She didn't have the strength to swim hard. Right under the raft. She swam past the raft's anchor chain, where she had tied her dungarees and shirt. They floated in the green water like flags. She was halfway under the raft when her lungs started to burst. She was 3/4 the way under the raft when she realized she was going to drown. And it was a few long agonizing moments after that before she finally swam out from under the raft and came up out of the water, gasping for breath. She gripped the raft with her hands. What was that on her hands? For some reason Tina could only see out of her left eye, but still she could clearly see these long, slimy black things attached to her hands and forearms. She opened her mouth to scream, but it was as if her mouth were stitched shut. She put a hand to her mouth, which meant she fell back into the water. Now she felt the big black leeches that were sucking from her lips, her cheek, her right eye. She tried to pull herself up onto the raft. Horror gave her new energy. She spasmed upward, but still she didn't have the strength to get out of the water. Frantic, she started swimming again, breaststroking around to the side of the raft with the metal ladder. Her arms were so weak. She pulled herself up rung after rung and dragged herself onto the deck like a dying fish. She was naked, but she didn't look it. The huge leeches had covered her body from the toes up, like a bumpy suit of rubber. She pulled at the leeches with both hands, but they held fast. They seemed to be attached to her with cement. Tina felt like her heart was breaking with fear, but she couldn't even scream. With her good eye she watched the leeches, their slimy, hideous bodies bulged as they sucked out the last of her blood. Kelly came out of the woods. The huge orange sun was slowly setting, sinking right into Crystal Lake. She came down to the water's edge to watch. It was a beautiful sight, the way the round red disk broke as it went behind the water's horizon line. The orange reflection melted into the water on all sides. Well, she wasn't here to admire the scenery. Besides, it was starting to get dark again, and with the darkness came her old terror. Boone had warned her. Tonight was the night. She took a step back, turning to go, and stepped on something loose. Her ankle turned painfully. Cursing, she walked around the bank in circles, trying to walk off the pain. Then she saw what had tripped her. The tape recorder, the one she had lent to Miguel and Tina. She picked it up and straightened quickly, her body suddenly tense and alert. "Miguel!" she called. "Tina?" The only sounds she heard in response were the usual lake sounds, the hum of insects skimming along the lake's surface, the splash of water as little creatures dove in and out, the rivet of the lake's big frogs. She looked out at the lake, but the water was calm and unbroken as far as she could see. Then she looked down at the tape player in her hand. She pressed rewind, then stop, then play. Static, and then, "Listen, there's something I've got to tell you." Tina's voice. "Last night, Doug and I did more than watch that stupid trap, okay?" Kelly jammed her finger down on the stop button. She hit rewind. She played it again. This time she let the tape keep going. She was so stunned, she could barely hear the words. "You figure it out. Doug and I are going out now, get it? We're an item. You want me to draw you a picture? He's dumping Kelly as soon as we get back home." Kelly felt her stomach heave. Betrayed. She stared down at the tape player, watching the tiny spools slowly turning, as if they were hypnotizing her. Then she lifted the tape behind her head, ready to pitch it out into the lake. Just then, the tape played back Tina's blood-curdling scream. Kelly dropped the tape recorder and started to run.
There's a man with no life in his eyes. There's a man with no life in his eyes.
Okay, this has been chapters 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22 of Friday the 13th, Jason's Curse by Eric Morse. I'll be back tomorrow with the conclusion of this great book. Hope you guys are enjoying the story so far. I think tonight a couple characters met the end that they kind of deserved. Doug and Tina have gone bye-bye. We're unsure of Miguel's current status, but we'll get to that in a moment. But man, what a way to go. I mean, poor Darlene got chopped up and thrown around the cabin. Doug skewered himself by falling into the trap. Maybe he should have got a little more sleep, right? And Tina was sucked to death by leeches. No blood whatsoever left in her body. That, yeah, I can't even imagine being covered in leeches. Oh my God. Did any of y'all catch the little song I played at the end? Can anybody tell me in the comments section which Friday the 13th movie that song is from? I actually think most of that song fits with this whole possession angle in Eric Morse's Friday the 13th books. People being possessed by the Jason mask and pretty much the spirit of Jason taking over them. Let me know in the comments section who you think told Big Red of Miguel's location in the grounds. Any guesses out there? Let's see your guesses, and tomorrow we'll see if anybody was correct. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and have a great night.
Whew. Hey! This is William Pattison, known to Friday the 13th fans as Eric Morse, and you are listening to 80s Slasher Librarian's narration of my book, Friday the 13th, Jason's Curse. Enjoy.